So, if you've watched some of the previous videos of mine, you'll notice that I've been basically flattening out and thinning and basically changing the shape of these mouthpieces on my pipes. And this is a Falcon, of course. And Falcons, I think I've noticed just have these really slippery stems. And the material, I don't really know what it is, but I think it's somewhat similar to vulcanite, because when I sand it, unlike acrylic, it smells like vulcanite. So it has a very sulfuric smell. And this one, I've kind of finished my sanding process, and I'm basically changing and editing my sanding process as I go and figuring out different things that I can do. So this video is kind of just a rant of things that I'm hearing online, or basically just reading online, and things that I'm figuring out myself for changing the stem to kind of fit my needs. So of course, like most pipe stems, this stem is basically what I would consider a rounded bite zone. So if you look at it from this angle, it's round because the button is round. But if I were to chop the button off, so just this button portion off completely, then you would basically see right now a very flat edge, and then a slightly rounded off edge. And that's because I flattened it, because originally, even after the button, if I were to chop off from this angle, it would still be rounded like this. And my theory so far is that if you have a rounded surface, a rounded bite zone that my teeth are actually biting on, like so, what's happening is there's only so much surface area that my teeth can actually touch. And in order to use this, I'm just going to use an analogy of picking this kind of rounded thing. And if you consider your teeth are usually kind of flat like this. And so you'll kind of like one tooth here that has this flat end and another tooth here that's flat. And what ends up happening is you have a very small amount of surface area. So this little point is kind of always touching, really. So you're not getting very much surface area on your teeth. But let's say you have something that's flat and your teeth are relatively flat, then they're getting quite a bit of surface area. So one tooth is getting that much surface area, this tooth is getting that much. And that's kind of what I see. When I clench, I'm pretty much always clenching with these two teeth, the canine and whatever that tooth is next to it, and underneath, a similar situation. So what I like about flattening out these stems, or the bite zone of the mouthpiece, is that it seems that I get a little bit more surface area, and it seems to give me more of this grip, if that makes sense. Like there's usually going to be a lot more grip, or a lot less grip here, if only a little bit of surface area is touching with my teeth, but there's going to be a lot more grip if there's a lot more surface area. I might be wrong about this. Maybe this is just my own personal teeth are just different or something, or built differently, something like that. But it seems that with this pipe, which I just would hate clenching because it would slip around, like so, it'll slip around in this direction a ton. Even after I've completely polished this with white diamond polish, I've gone through all of the sanding process that I've done before, which is of course first a really coarse sand where I take this down to the shape that I want, and then I keep going up the sanding grits, and then to polishing paper, then to white diamond, polishing on a buffing wheel, and then of course carnauba wax to just shine it up in the end. Even after going through all that process, it seems to have grip. And like way in the past when I was first trying this out and testing this out, on this specific mouthpiece, I just used a very low grit sandpaper to see if the grit would make it a little bit grippier. And it did to some degree, but the funny thing is my teeth would then just polish it back down to the slippery, the slippery vulcanite-ish material that it is in the first place. And when I grip it with my teeth, I don't know if you can see, but it's still very slippery. It's a very slippery, almost self-lubricating, almost Delrin, or trying to think of like another plastic, very slippery, like HDPE, very slippery type of plastic feel to it. If I compare it to like this acrylic stem, it's kind of hard to see, I guess, but it just feels a lot more grippy, even though I've gone through the same polishing and final carnauba wax system that I've done with this acrylic stem. This acrylic stem I've also shaped. It used to be an actual fishtail shape, and now it's very much a kind of a squared off shape that's very similar to the Peterson Bulldog 150 mouthpiece shape toward the end. But of course, yeah, that's my current kind of thing that I'm working on is this, or that I just finished today, is this Falcon mouthpiece. And it feels great. It feels so much better to me. And the great thing about thinning this bite zone of the stem is it actually makes a more prominent button, of course. The button is almost a full, I don't know, like a millimeter or half millimeter or so. Yeah, maybe like a full half millimeter more prominent. And of course, Falcon makes these mouthpieces called the dental mouthpiece, I think is what it's called. But it has like a very, very pronounced upper part to its button. It's like incredibly pronounced. And I don't know, maybe it's something that in the future I'll just try out, and it might be the greatest mouthpiece I've ever used. It does look a little weird, kind of looks kind of strange. And I think it was made for people who don't have teeth or something, I don't really know exactly. But it seems that it's a lot more comfortable this way. And fortunately, I haven't actually smoked this, so I haven't actually given it a try. But I think it might actually be tolerable now. I was considering just giving this away. I mean, the resale value of these things is obviously very low because the stem itself is maybe $25. In this briar bowl, it's probably worth about $25, or sold for $25 new on smokingpipes.com right now. USD, of course. What was the last thing I was gonna rant about? Oh yeah, my process for sanding is a little different. So what I originally did is I just would search tobacco pipe forum or pipe forum, sanding mouthpiece, or editing mouthpiece, changing mouthpiece. And I would basically always find the same forum post where it was a person talking about using a file, or different people talking about using a file with a safety edge. So in other words, it'll basically be, if this is a file and this top area has little whatever that is, like the teeth, the cutting, whatever that is, the sandy portion of the file, instead of having also another sandy portion here, it's simply only on the top, and then you would run your mouthpiece against it like that. So I don't know, I want to go on the cheap. I don't want to go and buy too many things because I'm already buying pipes and the pipe acquisition disorder is horrible. So I was thinking, what if I just use sandpaper and I literally put it on a very square edge like this. So I just had a piece of plastic that had a very square edge to it, and I was doing this for a while. What I would end up with is a not very precise mouthpiece. I'll show you an example of it. And this is the Pimpernel, which is a French manufactured pipe that I stained recently. This used to be just almost like an unstained briar that had been polished type color. I stained it the scarlet, but also I worked on the vulcanite stem. And it's very hard to see or tell from this angle, but the button is, instead of the button being mouthpiece button in a very sharp square manner, it's mouthpiece and then kind of curves up to the button. And this is kind of my fault. When I got this, it looked almost as if someone had just heated up the mouthpiece and just kind of formed it somehow or something. I think there's a certain process that pipe makers do. I don't know, it's almost like they just have like a rod or something and they like smash it or something and then they start cutting. I don't know. But it just looked very kind of smashed and had pretty much no button whatsoever when I got it. And it's kind of understandable because it's a church warden. And usually people aren't clenching church wardens very much. Like, people usually don't walk around and clench church wardens or a bouncy. They're usually holding it with their hand to some degree. But I thought, I still want to have a button on it. And so I filed it down. But that process was not very good. So rather than having a very square surface like this, where I would put the sandpaper on like that, I think I was just putting the sandpaper on a not very square surface, just kind of idly just going about without really looking at it carefully. My current process is I take a very small, I basically take the sandpaper and I flip it upside down. Should probably have actual sandpaper for this, but I'm going to use this Blue Room Briars card that they gave me. So if you imagine this is sandpaper, and this is the non-sandpaper edge, this one's sandpaper. So I have the slippery non-sandpaper edge, and I would just simply fold a very small amount of the sandpaper, so maybe about a 1 centimeter thick bit of the sandpaper up like this. It's really all I would need. And then I'll put that on a very square edge, like this. So a piece of plastic that's very square. And I'll let the rest of the sandpaper hang. And purposely I want to make sure this is slippery and not sandpaper, and only here is sandpaper. There's a reason for that. And then of course I would go back and forth this way. So what that means is that to some degree I'm kind of cutting in a little bit into the button, somewhat, but it's very negligible. And my teeth are never going to reach inside of there. My teeth are not square, they're kind of rounded behind my teeth, so it doesn't matter all that much. And I feel like it's maybe a good idea even to leave a little tiny bit of a slope there, just for strength, I guess, to make sure, I don't know, maybe like someday like the vulcanite won't just like chip off or something. And it seems that this produces enough precision, just going back and forth like this, that that seems to cut into it enough. So this is like a 240 grit that I was doing this on back and forth when I'm first doing my initial cut to shape it. And I noticed that if I go back and forth to cut a little bit, and then I start doing circles, so circular motions more up and down. So first just cutting in, and then a little bit more of these circular motions. That makes sure that I don't just have this cut in area where there's a complete divot, and then there isn't this like a sudden divot, and then it just goes back up to the normal shape. It's a little bit hard to explain, but on this one there's a really big divot that's going on, and then it goes back to its original shape. And it kind of makes it look like, oh, someone just went in and just filed it off. So it seems like if I do that, it's a lot better. What ends up happening is I have to chop off or just tear off that little bit and then fold a little bit more and do that over and over again. So I had to do a lot of tearing off sandpaper, but it means that with a very small piece of sandpaper and just a square edge, I get like a very good precision that turned out really perfectly on this, or not perfectly, but almost perfectly, enough that it's not very noticeable on this Falcon. I obviously put a lot more time and effort into this one. This Pimpernel stem I just felt like was kind of, a little bit off looking in the first place. You'll notice like the rest of the stem too is a little off, like it's kind of malformed and not perfect. It's a little bit imperfect, so I was just okay with that in general. It's so thin, and it's so, I don't know, it was a bit of an experiment at the time. But that's, it's interesting. This stuff isn't really talked about or discussed very much on like the bigger pipe channels, of course. And I do find it very strange to me. Like it would be interesting to just talk to a pipe maker and say, why are bite zones almost always rounded? And my guess to it might have something to do with, like, why is it rounded, right? I don't really know, and I was trying to think. And I'm guessing like maybe something that has to do with it is the fact that like mouthpieces you have to bite. And I'm guessing there's going to be some people whose teeth, like with my teeth this is the case, but my bottom canine is actually where most of the weight of the pipe bears on when I clench. And with this pipe made in Barclay Rex, which is a New York tobacconist, it was made there. And there, I think like when I look it up, I think apparently there was some Italian pipe maker who went and moved there and started to make pipes. But with this pipe, it has an already incredibly thin, and I believe this is the original. I don't think anyone changed it or edited it from what I can tell, but this is the original thickness. It's very thin in the bite zone too. And you'll see right here there is a definite little dot where someone's tooth had really poked into, to the point that it really indented the vulcanite. And if I look inside of it, inside of the, I don't know what you call that, the draft opening where it fans out, there's kind of a bit of an indentation in there. So my guess is that, pipe makers over the years, they've probably realized that this is kind of an issue when you have teeth poking through, that you probably want to have a stronger structure And you know how bridges are shaped kind of in this way rather than just completely flat. They're kind of rounded usually. And so anything hitting it will be supported a little bit better. That's my guess. It's probably rounded. The bite zones are rounded just as more of a support, so you don't get the crushing of the whatever that draft hole opening is at the very end of the button. That's my guess. It's a little bit stronger in that sense. And so maybe over time, as someone's smoking, they won't come back and complain about how their pipe stem's all closed up. But luckily in my case, I know that that's something that I can very easily fix by simply heating it up with a torch lighter or with really what I should do with a heat gun, heating it up very carefully and taking a very long time with a heat gun and opening it up with the right kind of tool, probably even this pokey metal tool, just opening it up would be enough to open up that hole so that it's not completely crushed. But that's my guess. And finally, this is really the only pipe I've ever seen this done with. But this Graco pipe, when I saw this on eBay, the primary reason why I bought it, not only because it was incredibly cheap, I think it was like $15, so with shipping and everything it was under $20. But this is obviously before I refinished it, restained it, and refurbished it basically. But you'll notice that this mouthpiece is actually completely flat in the bite zone, and the what is this called? The saddle bit style bit is incredibly untapered, because usually saddle style bits are tapered anyway, but it's almost incredibly untapered. It's like just completely untapered, and it's completely flat, and it sits on my teeth just amazing, perfectly. And this is really where I first thought, hey, I can completely flatten out the bite zone. It's doable. And with this one, it's relatively thick compared to a lot of other pipes that I have. Like this T Cristiano, it's a saddle bit, but it's relatively tapered, and it tapers down to a very thin area, and it's acrylic. So with acrylic, obviously you get the breakage that could happen. It could snap and break. So I don't know if I really want to edit this anymore. It kind of sucks because the button is very small. It's a very non-prominent button compared to this. I don't know if you can see the difference there. It's a lot of difference. Very tiny button, a very prominent button, very flat, and by far like the most comfortable clencher I've ever had. I have no doubt that if it slips around at all, it won't fall on my teeth, because that button is always there to protect and to keep it from falling out. But with this pipe, this T Cristiano Metamorphosi, it just seems possible, seems kind of likely. And unfortunately, in the end of the day, if I look from this profile, this is a rounded bite zone regardless. It's not a truly flat bite zone. This bite zone is truly flat on the top, and the edges are just very slightly rounded. It's another thing that I think is strange. I want to ask pipe makers, why is that? Like, why don't you guys make these very squared off pipe stems? This one you can actually see a complete square going on, because when I sanded this down, sanded the edges down of the fishtail, I completely squared it off. And for some reason, it's just much more comfortable to me. Or maybe not for some reason, but you can see that it doesn't pull at the edge of my lips at all. You can tell that if this was any larger, then if I put it in this position, or this position for my face, it would actually be pulling on my lips slightly. Which is why I sold this GBD, which I probably should have sold it for a lot more. I sold it for like something like $60. That pipe was probably worth like, maybe it's possibly worth $150 if I waited long enough, because it was a pre-1981, at least from the stamping. It was kind of unusual too as a dry system GBD, but that GBD had a stem that was incredibly wide, probably the widest stem I've ever had. I saw that in my local brick and mortar, and I thought, hey, this is very unusual. This is kind of the kind of pipe I don't like. It was just slightly bent. I usually don't like slightly bent pipes because I can't hold them in these fun positions, but at the same time, it's not a complete hanging clencher. It doesn't hang fully like this pipe at all. So maybe it wasn't really the pipe for me, but nowadays I know that I can actually change the mouthpiece. So I could have kind of destroyed its value, changed the mouthpiece quite a bit. Maybe I could somehow hide the fact that it had been changed or something by doing a really good job. Probably kind of impossible, but I don't know, interesting thoughts. Maybe at some point I'll make like a more succinct video on these thoughts on mouthpiece shapes. Or I should actually do a little more research and actually ask a pipe maker about mouthpiece shapes and why they do different mouthpiece shapes, what's the history on mouthpiece shapes. I'm sure people know a lot more about that than me. All right, bye.